Nintendo!
Hey everyone, this is Chrono. Welcome back to another boss guide. Today we'll be covering Kurog Grimtotem in the Vault of the Incarnates raid on Heroic and Mythic difficulties. This one is a bit of a jump up in difficulty compared to all the ones that came before him, so I hope you're ready for a challenge. Once again, footage in this video is from the beta raid testing and is subject to change. Without further ado, let's get started. The room you fight Kurog in has 4 different altars, each representing a different element. In the north, you'll have Storm, then going clockwise, you have Earth, Frost, then Fire. Bringing Kurog close to one of these quadrants will attune him to that element, dealing a burst of raid damage and giving him a new set of abilities. You don't want to move him around often, since this burst of damage does an insane amount if you do it more than once every 20 seconds. While Kurog is attuned to an altar, the raid takes passive ticking damage, ramping based on how many stacks of the associated dominance buff Kurog has. Kurog gains a stack when he uses the ultimate ability for his current altar. He also gains several during the intermission. These stacks last the entire fight. The tank mechanic for this fight is Thundering Strike. This is a frontal cone that knocks back anyone that gets hit and leaves a long-lasting dot. Use your discretion for when a taunt swap is needed, but during heroic testing we were able to handle at least 3. We'll start by covering the mechanics at the Storm altar. A bunch of players will get picked by a lightning crash, indicated by arrows above their heads. This will make each of them take 30% more nature damage, and they begin zapping the nearest player over 8 seconds. You don't want to be zapping someone who also has the debuff, so before the arrows disappear, find a non-debuffed buddy and give them a nice hug. This will zap them for increasing nature damage that just has to be healed through. Thunderstrike is the ultimate ability for the Storm altar, and will spawn several circles that must be soaked. Soakers take a large amount of damage, and missing any of these will deal lethal damage to the whole raid. Next up is the Earth altar. Many players will be affected by Enveloping Earth, which absorbs a high amount of healing. Erupting Bedrock will spawn rings of earth that ripple outwards from the boss. Seismic Rupture is Kurog's ultimate earth ability. You'll want to avoid these swirlies. Adds will spawn from them that apply stacking debuffs that cause you to take more physical damage. The Frost altar was the one that we found to be the easiest one to deal with, on both Heroic and Mythic. Biting Chill does a modest amount of ticking damage to the raid over 10 seconds. Frigid Torrent will fire up projectiles from Kurog that hit for a large amount of damage and stuns you for 6 seconds. This stun can be magic dispelled, but you're probably better off not getting hit. Absolute Zero is Kurog's Frost ultimate. 2 players will be picked with a large circle that must be soaked by the raid. You don't want to overlap these. Anybody soaking both of them will be frozen solid and cannot be saved. Place 1 in melee and 1 in range, and everyone needs to help split the damage since it hits pretty hard. Lastly, we have the Fire altar, which causes the most disruption and forces a lot of movement out of the raid. Magma Burst spawns many large lava pools around the area and deals high ticking damage if you stand in it. Molten Rupture shoots out lines of swirlies from the boss that just needs to be sidestepped. Searing Carnage is his Fire ultimate that shoots out a series of projectiles at random players and does lethal damage. At around 70 and 30%, the intermission begins and Kurog jumps to the middle and takes practically no damage. 2 adds will spawn corresponding to the 2 highest dominance stacks that the boss currently has. For example, if you got him to use his ultimates at the Frost and Earth altars during phase 1, then the intermission will spawn the Frost and Earth adds. If there is a tie, then you'll get a random one. As you beat up the Fire add, chunks of him will fly off and create magma pools. Small adds will pop out of these once every 15 seconds. These just do a single target cast on random people and aren't a threat until there's a boatload of them. The Lightning add will teleport behind a random person and then channel a lethal current. This cleaves onto everyone near the target. Think of this as a Mind Seer. The Frost add will channel a circle around it, meaning it's time to get in melee on top of it. This Freezing Tempest does a lot less damage if you're inside. The Earth add forces the most movement out of the raid. Ground Shatter is a spread mechanic that does about half of your HP when it blows up. Violent Upheaval will spawn a bunch of swirlies that you have to move out of. For every 10 seconds that these ads are up, they gain a stacking buff. Once you kill the ad, these will transfer onto Kurog as dominant stacks. I know that was a lot, but hopefully you're still with me. Kurog has a lot of abilities in his arsenal, but you only have to manage a few at any given time. The good news is, depending on how certain variables shake up when this goes live, there's a possibility that you can choose to ignore entire altars altogether. This fight allows you to build your own adventure, and is a great opportunity for raid leaders to test their ability to plan strategies and make raid calls on the fly based on the current situation. Before we start, if you were curious about what happens if you never choose an altar and tank the boss in the middle of the room, I'm here to tell you it's not gonna work. Don't ever do that. It hurts. A lot. The most straightforward strategy would be to pick out 2 altars that you'll visit during phase 1. You'll get the boss to use his ultimate ability at each section, and then you'll do the same for the remaining 2 sections after the intermission. This would mean that your raid will see every mechanic at least once, including the annoying ones. However, it is worth considering a strategy where you just return to the same altars the entire fight, and ignore the rest. The Frost altar in particular was the easiest one to deal with because it allowed the raid the most time to hunker down and plow the boss. On top of that, the ticking damage the raid takes per dominant stack is noticeably lower in this quadrant than the other ones, so the raid can afford to stay here for higher stack counts. When this raid goes live, you should be mindful of whether or not changes are made to how the boss gains stacks, how fast he gains them, and how threatening it is to return to the same altar after each intermission. I feel like the Frost altar in particular wouldn't be unmanageable until the boss hits at least 20 stacks, which we never got anywhere close to during testing. If there isn't a deterrent for doing so, then I would definitely suggest just tunneling the Frost or Earth quadrants as much as possible, as those allow the most uptime for the raid to just DPS and deal with very straightforward mechanics. Regardless of what order you end up using for the altars, the boss enters the second intermission at around 30%. Once the ads are killed here, phase 3 begins and Kurog gains all abilities from every altar. We didn't get the chance to see this implemented during testing, so I'm not sure whether or not there's randomness to the abilities he uses here. Even if you go into this blind, the good news is that all of his abilities at every altar have visual cues that give you time to react accordingly. So as long as you understand the mechanics, phase 3 will just be one last test to see if your whole raid can keep it together, and close it out with a W. Kurog gains a few staggering changes on Mythic that makes him way more difficult compared to Heroic. First of all, every time you attune him to a different element, a Mythic only ad will spawn. There's a unique ad for each altar. All 4 of these have a hard-hitting frontal cleave that comes with a different secondary effect if you get hit. The Frost ad's cleave applies an intense slow. This ad also has the ability to cast its own Frigid Torrent. While this ad is alive, the raid needs to stay near each other, or you'll get frozen solid. The Earth ad's cleave will apply a massive heal absorb. Getting hit by this one will almost certainly get you killed, since Kurog himself already applies a huge heal absorb by default. Whenever Kurog uses Erupting Bedrock, this ad will follow it up with his own. The Storm ad's cleave applies a debuff that does massive delayed damage and an AoE around you after 12 seconds. It also casts a new ability called Orb Lightning, which summons 3 lightning balls that the raid has to catch. Touching these will apply a ticking dot on you that lasts 10 minutes and can stack. Failure to soak these will cause them to explode for lethal damage on the raid after 10 seconds. The Fire ad spawns his own lava pools, which can be distinguished by the glowing orbs above them. These will spawn a small ad every 15 seconds, and standing inside of the pool will cause it to shrink, while dealing damage to whoever soaks it. On top of these new ads, the other major change is that the boss now passively gains a dominant stack every time the aura ticks on the raid. These changes turn this boss into a pretty intense DPS check, as you now have a finite amount of time at each altar before the passive ticking damage becomes too overwhelming. This also means that coming back to the same altar may prove to be very difficult, if not altogether unviable. The reason being, if you spawn an ad at one altar and choose to come back to it later, it will still spawn a fresh ad. It's not just one Mythic ad per altar per pull. The Frost section continued to be the easiest one to deal with, since the only addition is a second cast of Frigid Torrent from the ad. Going to the Earth altar on Mythic shed a big light on just how much harder the Dominance aura ticks here. It does significantly more baseline damage, so every time it ticked and gained a stack, the healers really felt it. As soon as you bring the boss here, he applies a gigantic heal absorb on many players, and the passive ticking damage doesn't give you much time to heal these off. The raw ticking damage from this altar will likely force the raid to swap elements at lower stacks, meaning you'll be taking the ad with you to the next quadrant. The Storm altar is where the most personal responsibility comes into play, since you need to catch orbs, soak circles, and not zap the wrong players with a lightning crash. All of the mechanics here do a significant amount of damage, so you get very little wiggle room to make mistakes. This fight on Mythic will most certainly be the first major DPS check, as doing more damage will definitely make every altar easier to deal with, whereas not doing enough damage will make the boss just straight up impossible. I do appreciate that this fight doesn't wipe you from random one-shots. Whenever you wipe, it's generally pretty clear what events led to it. This boss is an intense DPS race and healing check with very few breaks, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing how this one turns out on live. This one took a lot longer than the previous one, so I hope it was worth the wait. I have one last guide left before the Dragonflight launch, so I should definitely be able to get that done soon. If you enjoyed this video, a like and a sub goes a long way in supporting the channel. I hope everyone enjoys their Thanksgiving break, and I'll see you next time for the penultimate boss.